My name is Dave Evers. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this short, sharp webinar, How to Maximize Your Innovation Assets. It's brought to you by the University of Auckland Business School, Executive and Professional Development, and Alumni Relations. So my name is Dave Evers, and I'm the Business Development Manager for Executive and Professional Development. So my job is to work with the business school and organizations to develop professional development programs for teams and individuals. So before we get into our, before we get into our main program, just some housekeeping. So we'll get into the main program. If you'd like to ask questions during the event, please use the Q&A function and indicate who the question is directed to. We'll answer questions at the end of the program, but feel free to submit them as we're going along. If anything with the panelists resonates from you, please put it in the chat. We want to keep this, relatively interactive and we want to get we have a lot of participants on the line, so we certainly get your thoughts. And you can also uptick questions. So you can take a look at the questions that are being posted, and you can uptick them, and we'll get to them as we go along. So first, I'd just like to introduce our panelists, so our speakers and our hosts for today very quickly. So we first have Dr. Rachel Wright, who is the Director of Executive and Professional Development at the Business School. So prior to coming to the University of Auckland, Rachel was the Director of Enterprise and Entrepreneurship at the University of Canterbury. She has a PhD in biochemistry from Otago University and spent 10 years in Silicon Valley, initially as a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford, and then working in biotechnology. And she'll speak to you in a second about professional executive and development. Natalie Newton, who's our Alumni Relations Manager at the Business School, which delivers a range of programs and events and opportunities for alumni, and also want to say a special welcome to all the alumni from the University of Auckland that are on the call. And for our main speakers, we really excited to have Paul Adams, who is the founder and CEO of EverEdge Global, a global advisory and transaction firm specializing in intangible assets. So EverEdge helps companies convert intangible assets into increased margins, market share, and enterprise value. And if you don't know what that means, don't worry, we are going to get to that in Paul's presentation. Paul is also a director on several boards and a frequent speaker at conferences and on TEDx. He has 9 times been ranked as one of the world's top IP strategists. He also founded and developed and managed the Ice House, the University of Auckland's technology incubator, and Paul is also an alum of the university where he studied law. And also very pleased to have Dr. Peter Lee, who's an adjunct professor at the University of Auckland, where he teaches subjects related to innovation, commercialization, and entrepreneurship. He's a registered technology transfer professional and involved with several high growth and deep tech companies in the US and New Zealand as a board of director advisor. So Peter is the former CEO of Auckland Uni Services, which is the technology development and commercialization arm of the university, which has over 700 employees. And Peter's also an alum of the university with a PhD in engineering. So first, I'm going to ask Dr. Rachel Wright to say a few words about executive and professional development.
Thanks, Dave. Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to this webinar. This is the first of a series of webinars and events that we are going to be running on topics that we think are pertinent to helping businesses and organizations succeed in, hopefully, a post-COVID environment. We'll see that soon. And I just want to add thank you for those who are in Auckland for tuning in and not looking to see when you can go on your summer holiday, because I think we're all eager to learn when and where we can go at Christmas time. So thanks for being here today. The University of Auckland, like many other organisations, has gone through major change because of COVID. And with the new Vice Chancellor, a new vision and strategic plan has been developed So fundamentally, the university wants to create collaborative partnerships that enable global transformation and impact through their leading research, scholarship, and teaching. Their impact particularly wants to be around leading transition to sustainable ecosystems, improving health and well-being for all, advancing just culture engaged communities, innovating contemporary distributed secure knowledge systems. It does sound quite academic, but basically the university wants to work with organisations, businesses, people to make a difference within New Zealand and particularly in the Asia Pacific region. Next slide. Underpinning that is exec and professional development. We also have had to go through some major change and we have a new strategy. So our vision is to be a leading exec and professional development and lifelong learning provider in Australasia and beyond. What we want to do is deliver future-focused transformative programs that are underpinned by research and business that enable leaders and organisations to create impact and success. Fundamentally, what this means is we want to create partnerships with organisations and individuals to help them create the learning programs that they need to build the capabilities within organisations so that they're successful. We're able as a team to leverage the expertise that we have across the university and our wider ecosystem to enable businesses to do what they need to do to be successful. And ultimately, as a team, we want to contribute to this post-COVID world and enable us to create a prosperous and equitable New Zealand society for all. Today, you're going to get a short, sharp taste of the future of our programs, which is a combination of academic and thought leadership and industry best practice. And that is now interwoven across all our programs. So I really hope that today you walk away with something that you can apply to your business pretty much or organisation pretty much immediately. And if you're interested in learning more about what we're doing in our new future and our new programs, please do get in touch. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you. Okay, great. And I'd like to go to Natalie Newton, who's like to welcome our alumni. Thank you, Natalie.
Thanks, Dave. Kia ora koutou, everyone, and a warm welcome to all our business school alumni on the call today. I just quickly wanted to outline some of the current opportunities for both alumni and industry to engage with the business school and our students. So first of all, we are currently looking for women working in business to act as mentors on our 2022 Women's Mentoring Program, He Ira Wahine. And in this program, we match between 70 and 80 businesswomen with our women business students for a 6-month mentoring program. It starts in March next year, and the program's headed by our executive in residence at the business school and university chancellor, Cecilia Tarrant. It involves monthly events and networking opportunities. So if you're a woman working in business and you're keen to share your experience and guidance with our women students, we'd love you to apply. The deadline is the 30th of November, and we'll be including more information about this program in the follow-up communications after this event. The next opportunity is for any University of Auckland alumni. You can actually mentor our University of Auckland students through our online mentoring platform. It's called Alumni Connect. We'll send out the link after this session, but it's a great way for alumni to give back to current university students. And then just a couple of other opportunities that might interest you. If you have a business challenge that you'd like a student or a group of students to work on, our master's students are always looking for projects from industry to complete their degrees in areas such as marketing, supply chain, and analytics. So get in touch if that sounds interesting. And for anyone working in the innovation, entrepreneurship, or startup space, our award-winning Centre for Innovation and Entrepreneurship is always looking for those in industry to get involved in their programs as either mentors or judges. So many ways you can engage with us. So looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Natalie. Okay, now we'd like to move into our main program. So Peter Lee and Paul Adams will each speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll follow that by discussion and Q&A. So as I mentioned, put your questions into the box, into the Q&A feature, and we'll get to that at the end. But you can enter that as we go along. So Peter, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. So hi, everyone. I'm very excited about innovation, and I'm delighted to share some insights with you today. Because ideas are very special. They are one of the few things that become more and more numerous the more we use them. They get better with use. So recently, there's been a lot found out about the source of ideas. And this knowledge is where we'll start today. Knowing the mechanisms by which ideas develop and spread provides us and our organizations with a foundation to become much better inventors and innovators. Next, Dave. So we each have 100 billion neurons. Clusters of these neurons are considered to store our memories, our emotions, our knowledge. And invention is a consequence of the brain's incessant search for novel associations among these many clusters of neurons. If we have a passion for some outcome, the brain can cleverly associate some of these aha moments with some of those desirable outcomes. So how do we increase the rate of hits, of successful outcomes? So first of all, we've got to give ourselves a chance to do this. And the best time for this inventive process is when we're in tranquil moments. We're not busy doing rational thinking and all that hectic stuff we do all day, but it's in those tranquil moments when the brain does what it does well, which is to do this random association. So you might think, well, being asleep is a good time. Well, yes, dreams and so on, but it's better to have the daydreaming process because that's when you can capture those ideas and do something with them. So allow yourself to have those extracurricular activities and just take some time off and allow the brain to really get busy inventing. You want to have a lot of these thoughts and emotions that are somewhat related to the area in which you're trying to invent. So you need to expose yourself to that kind of information. So you have to be kind of extroverted and going out there and getting these new experiences and storing them away for this innovation to occur. Now, the same process that goes on inside the brain is occurring socially amongst our groups. And there you want to have more associations with people, and you want those associations to be somewhat provocative. That is, you don't want to necessarily just stay with the same group of people who tell you what you already know. You want to give yourself a little bit of chance to meet with people who can give you insight, new insights and new inspirations. Dave, next. So what we're talking about is bringing together the adjacent possible. Consider this heavier than air flight invention. Now, we claim as New Zealanders that Richard Pearce was the person who first took off in heavier than air flight. In fact, we claim it was 9 months before the Wright brothers. But if you look around, actually, there were many more people who took off at about the same time within months of each other. For example, Alexander Graham Bell took off at the same time, around the same time. So that is hundreds of years since we found out about Bernoulli and the airfoil effect of being able to lift objects. We had to wait until early 1900s to get this heavier than air engine, this high powered lightweight engine, to put together the associated contacts and bring that adjacency to fruition. So some of these adjacent possibles take a long time to occur, but when they occur, they can occur to a lot of people at the same time because we're all looking at the same data sets. So a lesson for you here is, as you invent, don't wait around, because it's likely that someone else will be inventing very quickly the same thing as you have. Dave, next. Another consequence. I think you've gone one too far, Dave, sorry. That's it. Okay, so no, that's good, dude. We can go next one. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. Okay, so let's look at the link with information to scale. So if information is the source of the ability to grow quickly, because we can associate these ideas much more quickly, then if you've got a business or an idea or a project, you actually want to associate it with information. So in this instance here is an example of a company that I work with in the US, and they've tackled the problem of being able to predict whether wooden power poles will fall over. Now that might sound a little bit mundane, but in fact, this trillion-dollar asset is carrying the whole electrical infrastructure of the US and broadband as well. So you really want to know where it's going to fall over. Current state of art is to hit the pole with a hammer and listen if it's hollow. I guess if it's hollow, it goes bong. If it isn't, it goes bing. And you try and figure out whether it's a bing or a bong. Not very sophisticated. Okay, so this company came up with a means of looking at the interior of the pole using ultrasonics. And they can look and see weaknesses in the pole. Great business, growing rapidly. But the issue is it's not scalable. That is, you have to do one more test to get one more piece of information and one more piece of revenue and profit. It's linear. But let's look at the information. Every time we do a test on a pole, we can combine that piece of information with all the tests we've done with all the other poles in that municipality, in that region. Now, that extra piece of information then becomes geometrically more valuable because it's associated with all that other information. What can you do with it? Well, now you can start putting it together with weather data to predict if that pole is going to be blown over. You can put it together with network effects to find out if that really is a problem, or if that pole is right at the end of the network and it doesn't matter if it falls over. So putting your device together with information means it can scale with information. So look for those opportunities to scale. Dave, next. Okay, so we want to get together with people, right? Yes, because they give us a stimulation. So here's a typical organization chart. We've seen them all, right? It's linear, it's kind of boxes and line diagrams where everyone's connected. And this is one for a mining company. Now that mining company is comprised of geological engineers who go out and figure out where there might be oil and gas. Then you have the drillers who go in and just confirm that's the case. And then you have the whole production line. Nice and linear, industrial process, one hands off to the other. But that's not how an idea company works. Idea companies, in fact, work like on the right. This is how that company actually communicates. It's a scrambled egg, but within that system, there is a node or nodes. Look at Mitchell, right in the middle of everything. Now, Mitchell talks to everybody. He's a bit of a chatterbox, but people go to him because he cares, he's thoughtful, he's got insights, he's got connections. Mayer's the CEO, only had 2 connections, and one was Mitchell. So Mitchell is super valuable in terms of the innovation profile of that company. So I want you to go back to your companies, your organizations, and look around and see if you can find Mitchell. You might find them at the coffee pot. And what they look like? Well, they look very friendly. You probably had a chat with them already. And better still, become Mitchell. Dave, next. So this can not only occur, this association can not only occur within your company, but it can occur among companies. So this is the old 2 degrees of separation in New Zealand, right? Here we see a company called NanoLayer, and it produces a product called Active Layer. NanoLayer spins, electrospins NanoLayer fibers into films that are useful, in this case, for cosmetics. In this product, there is a soluble mask that's produced, which you put on your face, and collagen dissolves into the skin and makes you beautiful and young, and it's irresistible. Very popular in Korea and Asia, moreover. But how did this come about? It took the collaboration of many organizations within New Zealand and unexpected associations, quite frankly. So I think we have somebody on the line from Sanford. Sanford Fisheries have hoki skins, and hoki skins contain a soluble collagen. Plant Food had the technology to extract that collagen. LASRA, Leather and Shoe Research Association, knows a lot about collagen. And then you have New Zealand Extracts, which have all sorts of natural extracts, such as manuka oils, which you can put together with the collagen and add value to it. Who would have thought that collection of companies would have something in common? It's called the Crazy Quilt Program. It takes Mitchell to get out of the company and go and talk and explore associations. It's a test and try type of effort to build this crazy quilt up. So if you're good at interacting in the company, have a go at doing the same thing externally and bring together these kind of collaborations. Dave, next. So let's say we get a good idea. It's not always typical that a company will be able to do something with it. And a classic example is Kodak. Many of you rightly remember that once upon a time, not so long ago, we made photographs using film and paper. And that film and paper was an analog process. Of course, we know today that photographs are mostly taken digitally. And Kodak, in fact, went bankrupt in 2012 after a long, slow death. The irony of it is that Kodak was the one that invented a digital camera. And here we see the inventor, Steve Sassoon, proudly showing his toaster-sized invention on his shoulder, going to the senior management, let's say, and saying, look, I have a camera that doesn't need paper and it doesn't need film. What kind of a reaction did he get? Well, Kodak said, actually, Steve, sorry to say this, but we produce film and paper and we make a lot of money out of it. So a filmless camera doesn't ring our bell. Not very receptive to new ideas, unfortunately. Now, there's lots of examples like this, and today's businesses have seen those examples. And more or less, we're saying this is not the right thing. We have to be more receptive. So how? Dave, next. Well, we've got to realize there's two cultures at work here. There's the exploiting culture, which is what we spend most of our time doing, which is making the best and the most out of what we already have. But there's also this little gadfly on the side called explore, where we're looking for more transformational change. The two cultures are different and they actually clash a bit. There's risk-taking and there's not risk-taking. There's adventurism and there's doing the same thing every day, but doing it better. So we need to be able to find how to make these two cultures coexist. One thing is just to acknowledge that they're different and say, isn't that wonderful? But there are some other things we could do. Dave, next. So one thing is we can take affordable losses. That's taking small risks to learn a little bit more, like playing poker. Put a little bit on the table, don't put all your chips in there at once, and allow yourself to learn from the experiments that you take. So my favorite example is Fonterra, and I think there's some people from Fonterra here on the show. So congratulations to you. I think this is wonderful. What you've done is you've run a milk business, which is shown by the first S curve of productivity versus performance, versus time. And you'd have to say that milk is probably on that plateau. You know, it's a commodity business, a price taker. You know, we're doing our best to do better on the farms and so on, but it's pretty stable. Now, you also might have heard that in the background, there is another way of making milk, which is synthetic milk. And this is growing proteins of milk using yeast in an industrial-sized vats. Now, will this new form of milk take over? Well, some would say, yes, it's the new revolution. Others will say, nah, it's not. People are not going to want to drink synthetic milk. Who's right? Well, we don't know. So what do? We buy an experiment to learn more. In this case, Fonterra bought some time bought some shares in a company that produces synthetic milk. So they're sitting on the sideline, listening to the development. It's unlikely that Fonterra is going to make synthetic milk, but boy, its core business is going to be much better informed because of that new knowledge. Just think about how much better the All Blacks might have played if they had a seat on the sideline of the Irish training camp last weekend. Dave, next. Okay, so I've taken you through what ideas are and where they come from, and I've interpreted that information in terms of you as an individual and your inventiveness, your organizations and what you might be able to do to make your organizations more inventive, and of course, how whole commercial ecosystem and how we can put together companies to make that work better. So I hope that's inspired you to want to learn more about invention and innovation. At this point, I would like to hand over to Paul, because Paul's going to tell us about how to protect those assets once you have, in fact, gathered them. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, Peter. And yeah, Paul, we're certainly looking forward to finding out how we can identify that next digital camera within our organization and not send the people out. So let me,
all right.
I will stop sharing my slides.
Okay, all right. So let me just bring that up. Hopefully everybody should be able to see that now. And we'll get started. So look, thank you.
Looks good. Yep.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you today. As Peter said and Dave said, I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes and then we're going to take some questions at the end. So Peter's laid up, I think, very, very well where ideas come from. I'm going to talk to you really about the output of R&D, which is intangible assets, which are essentially the outcome of an R&D process. So very quickly, who are we? EverEdge is an intangible asset specialist. We had to invent that term. There was really nobody who called themselves an intangible asset specialist when we first got started about 14 years ago. Done a lot of client engagements. Net Promoter Score is over 74%. For those who are familiar with Net Promoter Score, anything over about 50% is considered outstanding. I think the benchmark for management consulting is actually minus 22%. So we're pretty happy with that score. Our return on client fees is very strong, typically in excess of 10x. And as Dave mentioned, we've been ranked amongst the top IP strategists globally for the last 9 years consecutively. Nobody else in Asia or Pacific has ever achieved that accreditation. Clients range from the very, very large companies right way through to startups and so forth. What we do is really simple, actually. We work with either the company or its investors to do five key things. Number one, to identify what the intangible assets are. And typically we are the first company to actually ask that question, like, what are your intangible assets? Number two, to ask, are those assets strong or are they weak? And what are the risks associated with them? Number three, to strategize. And that really involves two steps. Firstly, to say, how do we protect these assets? How do we better manage them? And secondly, how do we make money from them? And once you understand how to make money from them, then you're in a position to value them. And so about half of our work is actually in the valuation of intangible assets, things like data, et cetera, or in intangible asset rich companies like raising capital, et cetera. And then finally, that once you've valued, you're in a position to be able to monetize, to be able to make money from them. So enough about us, let's talk about intangibles. So if you go back to 1975, intangible assets accounted for less than 17% of all company value. If you fast forward to today, it's about 90%. So, if you look at, and it doesn't really matter if you're talking about large companies or small ones, it's much the same, right? The top 5 companies by market cap are 98.2% intangible. If you look at most startups, technology companies, they're 100% intangible. And those intangibles are everywhere. So they're not just in the things that people traditionally think about, such as patents or trademarks, but they're in a whole host of different asset types and classes, things like obviously systems and processes, confidential information, regulatory approvals, data. To give you just one small example, we recently worked with a very large mall owner, and they've concluded that the value of the data coming off their malls is more valuable than the underlying physical malls themselves. And what we find is the research shows very clearly that these intangible assets, the things that Peter was talking about, they are now the primary drivers of virtually all company performance, right? That's where companies generate their earnings growth from today. And there's a very simple thought experiment you can do to prove this. And that is, let's think about a really very fixed asset, physical asset intensive industry, something like a steel mill. And let's pretend I gave you a free steel mill. I said, here you go, have a free steel mill. The catch is I get to keep all of the intangible assets. So I get to keep all of the software that runs the mill. I get to keep all of the customer supplier relationships. I get to keep the brand. I get to keep all of the industrial know-how. I get to keep the regulatory approvals. Well, what becomes very apparent very quickly is that regardless of the fact that on the mill on the balance sheet is recorded as an asset, it's actually a liability. The real value in the mill is the ability to run it safely and efficiently. And all of that is contained within the intangible assets. And without those intangible assets, you cannot generate any earnings growth from that mill whatsoever. Now, despite everything I've just said, this is what is actually going on, right? So this is a real photo, and yes, those are American tourists. What you find is that most companies are looking in the wrong direction, right? Most companies, most capital providers, both debt and equity, most lawyers and accountants, et cetera, still tend to focus on fixed assets. And we see companies running around tracking chairs and laptops and company cars and plant and equipment. And a real failure to recognize that this gap has opened up between, on the one hand, what your company accounts say And on the other, the actual reality of where value and growth and risk is occurring within the business, because all of that is occurring fundamentally within your intangible assets. And yet those things are relatively absent from balance sheets. Because if we look at the accounting treatment of intangibles, then the accounting standards that we use today were basically designed for this age. They were designed for an age in which it was an industrial age. It was actually about fixed assets and plant equipment and stock and inventory. And so if we look at what the accounting standards say about intangibles, then they are either completely off balance sheet, they simply don't make the balance sheet at all, or they go on under goodwill, in which case they tend to get lost as this simple, big amorphous mass we call goodwill, because you don't know what else to call it. Or the worst of the three, in fact, is they go on at cost. And cost is actually the worst of the three because it leads you to the erroneous conclusion that the number on the balance sheet is correct, when what I can tell you is almost universally it's not correct. And the reason why is a peculiar feature of the way intangibles behave. So much like Peter mentioned, the fact that intangibles they're one of those few things that get better and more useful the more they're shared. Well, intangibles have this other interesting feature that there's no correlation between cost and value with them. And by that, I mean, if we think about the desk that my laptop is sitting on, there is a definitive relationship between the inputs to the desk and the output value. In other words, if I look at the metal and the plastic and the wood and the glass that went into this desk, based upon those input value, my desk is never going to be worth $1 billion, unfortunately. But with intangibles, that's simply not the case. There is no relationship between the input value and the output value. And the way we can know this is actually, again, by looking at R&D. So if you look at most corporate R&D, most corporate R&D fails. Most corporates spend a large amount of money on R&D and they turn it into a small amount of money. A few startups, they tend to take a small amount of money and most of them fail and they turn it into $0. But a small number of startups, they take a small amount of money and turn it into a huge amount of money. And what that basically tells you is there's no correlation between cost and value with intangible assets at all. Now, this is very significant because those accounting standards and their treatment of intangible assets mean that on company reports, intangible assets are relatively absent from company reports. And that's important because the way your company describes itself then influences, for example, capital flows, the way investors think about your company, the way the bank thinks about your company. If you're an intangible asset rich company, 95% of your assets are intangible, you're trying to go and get a loan from a bank. Right? Secondly, it influences the regulatory framework. That's how the government thinks about you, in particular tax. So 60% of all international trade is actually in intra-company transfer pricing arrangements. That is big companies moving money around the world to minimize their tax burdens. And they justify it through the movement of intangible assets because they're not going to move physical factories. They move their brands or their software or their data. The third way that the relative absence of intangible assets from company reporting influences things is it influences risk and asset management and board behavior. Most boards, for example, focus on financial risk. Financial risk tends to overlook intangible asset risk because intangible assets don't feature in financials. And the last way is in terms of management behavior. And particularly when you end up with scenarios where management don't own a company, you can end up with some quite perverse behavior by management because of the way that intangibles are absent or otherwise from financial reporting. So the result of this, because on the one hand, we have these super valuable intangible assets, which drive virtually all value today and value creation today. And on the other hand, we know that they're relatively absent from financial reports, is what we find is that most C-suites, most boards of directors simply do not understand, number one, what intangible assets they actually own. That's extremely common. So most companies, when we first sit down with them, we're the first people to ask, what are your intangible assets? Number two, the extent of the risk. So every asset has risks. If you own a house, it can burn down. If you own a car, it can be stolen. Well, things like data and software and brands and trade secrets and patents and designs and regulatory approvals, they all have risks associated with them too. But if you haven't identified those assets in the first place, how can you manage the risks to them? The third way is that most companies do not understand how these assets impact their financial results. So a simple example, I can go into a market in Thailand and buy a t-shirt for $2. If I sew on a Prada label, that t-shirt's only worth $100. But if we think about how that's going to show on the P&L, it's going to be revenue $100, cost of goods sold $2, gross profit $98. Now we know the $98 came from the Prada brand, but in even a simple P&L, the connection between the asset that did the heavy lifting, the brand, and the margin, the $98, will very quickly get severed. So most companies can't even tell you what intangible assets where their actual margins are coming from, which intangible assets are doing the work. And it makes sense then if you don't understand what you own and you don't understand what your risks are and you don't understand how those assets impact your financial results, then how do you unlock value? So up until now, what I've talked about has been very theoretical. So what I want to do now is drive this down into some reality. And these are all examples of case studies of companies, what we've worked with, and how intangible assets profoundly altered their course, their direction. So this one here, and I've deliberately tried to give you A, examples from New Zealand and Australia, and B, a cross-section of different examples and different scenarios. So here we had a company that was being sold, and the investment bank managing the transaction did the classic 4x EBITDA style valuation. I don't know if any of you have been involved in valuing companies, but it's surprising how often the number is 4x EBITDA. And we got involved and we looked at what they're doing and went, hold on, the most valuable asset in this business is its data. And that data is off balance sheet and nobody's talking about it in the sales process. So we ended up taking over the sales process and we did two things very differently. Number one, we really talked about data. And number two, we targeted people who wanted to buy data, not who wanted to buy an operating business. And the reason why is that the people who wanted to buy data had a much bigger checkbook. And we sold that business for 32 times EBITDA. So the owner got 8 times the money that they otherwise would have expecting to get as a consequence of this transaction, of looking at the deal a different way. The assets were always there. The value just needed to be looked at differently. The second is this one, and here we see quite a different scenario, because here we have a New Zealand company entering into a JV with a much, much larger US company. The JV is valued at 50 million. Both parties have to contribute 25 million in cash. The issue for our client, they don't really have 25 million in cash. So we pointed out that they were contributing very valuable and tangible assets, namely data, software, and industry know-how to the transaction. So we said we need to value this stuff. They said, well, our Big Four accountant tells us you can't value it. And we said, well, that's wrong. So we valued it up, provided it to the counterparty, the US company. The US company has zero interest in accepting the valuation because it means they're going to have to pay more money. So they said, well, we think the intangibles are worth what they're on the balance sheet for, which is zero. Well, that was convenient. To which we responded, well, if they're worth $0, let's pull them out of the JV because they're not worth anything. And then they went, no, we need those because that's why we're doing the JV. I said, okay, so they do have a value. And ultimately, consequence was our client, instead of needing to pay 25 million in cash, they only needed to put in 3 million in cash. We saved them $22 million because of the value of their intangibles. The value was always there. It had to be articulated correctly because it didn't show up within the financials. Here we had a startup and it had a game-changing technology, but it did, as I mentioned, what most startups do. It failed, right? And the management team abandoned the business. The investors are left with the failed company. They approached us and they said, well, what do you think? And we looked at it and went, yeah, we think there's some real value here. And so we took over we looked at the assets, identified them, assessed them, valued them, etc., and ultimately ran a sales process and sold them for tens of millions of dollars. And in fact, we returned $45 back to those investors for every $1 they invested into the business. So that's like a VC style return on a salvage operation. Here we had another scenario. Here we had a company that had, and you can tell this is a New Zealand company because they were trying to export fresh dairy, which is a crazy proposition. And they approached us and we said, well, look, you've got this, we've got this product, but you've got this really interesting packaging here. Why don't we do something with the packaging? And their initial plans was set up manufacturing sites all around the world. And we said, look, that's not going to work. You don't have the capital reserves to do that. So why don't we license it instead? It's a totally different approach to market. And so we helped them to run a licensing campaign utilizing these intangible assets. And they've shipped over 1 billion units globally. The royalty revenue now in the millions per year. And royalties are almost entirely EBIT. So that means that we've actually increased this company's EBIT by 15-fold. which even if you times it by a ×4 multiplier on valuation, that's a 60-fold, 15 times 4, 60-fold increase in the value of the business. But earnings from royalties are much, much higher quality. They typically attract 200 to 250% higher multiple than normal. So that's like a 10 times multiplier on a 15-fold increase in EBIT is a 150-fold increase in the value of the underlying business. This one here was a client who developed some very, very disruptive data center technology. Their first raise straight out of the block was 100 million. That's what they needed to raise. Big Four accounting firm valued them at 40 million pre-money. The raise is non-viable. They approached us. We looked at what the intangibles were doing and how impactful they were likely to be on the industry. And they were entirely intangible at this point. There's nothing physical in the ground. And we valued them closer to 200 million. It would be fair to say the Big Four accounting firm did not agree with us. But our client took the valuation to a major investment bank in New York, who said, we love this. And they went out and raised 400 million in equity and 750 million in debt. And in Q4 2019, they exited for 3.2 billion. So the point of all of these stories is that the traditional way of valuing and thinking about value of ideas and intangible assets is very simplistic. The typical way of even valuing a company is you take your fixed assets and your cash and you put it into operation, and that generates a cash flow. And hopefully that cash flow is positive and it generates a positive EBITDA, and you multiply it through some industry standard multiplier and you generate a number. But it's very mechanical. And what it fails to recognize is that, number one, your intangible assets are what actually drive your cash flows. That's the lesson of the steel mill. That's what the steel mill tells us was going on. Secondly, that your intangible assets are what generate strategic value. They're what leads companies to pay a much higher multiple up and above anything that you would normally get for a simple cash flow multiple. And that's what all these examples that I've just been through. The value was in the strategic value of the intangible assets, not the underlying economics. And although we've only got 15 minutes today, I can't get into this. Intangible assets are also a source of very substantial risk that can't be ignored either. So what now? What's the takeout from all of this? Well, you can't do this, right? You can't unring the bell now that you know about this stuff. And if there's any motivator beyond that to not ignore it, it's the fact that directors and officers of companies actually have a fiduciary obligation to generate a return on and manage risks to all assets under their stewardship and control. And all doesn't mean just physical assets, it means all. It means including intangible assets. So what should you do if you're a company? Well, the first thing is that you need to identify what your intangible assets actually are, because they're your most valuable assets. You need to assess these assets. You've got to develop a strategy to protect and exploit them, to value them appropriately, because humans don't value things that doesn't have a price tag attached to it, basically. And then to monetize on them, to find out a way to extract more value from them. So in summary, what I would say is there's been a massive migration of value and risk over the last 45 years, but it's not typically reflected in the accounts. Intangibles are now the primary drivers of virtually all company performance and therefore risk. And it's a trend that's not going back. It's not, we're not going to see all of a sudden physical assets, bricks and mortar become so much more important. The arrow is only pointing one day, right? The cake is baked, and intangibles are going to become more and more important going forward. So thank you very much. Hopefully that's been useful. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I think we hopefully have some questions that would be very happy to take. Dave, you're on mute. Dave, you're on mute. Now, there we go. Oh, no, you took yourself on and went off. There we go.
There you go. I think the moderator unmuted me. Great. So yeah, so thanks, Paul. That was great. We do have a few questions. We'll have a bit of a discussion. So first, Paul, maybe for you, Zeb asked, how do intangible assets reflect the value in the non-for-profit space, given the aim of organizations here not for sale or joint ventures or share value? So that's interesting, because we have a lot of people here working in nonprofits.
Sure. So your intangibles are what enable you day to day, right? So even if we ignore a capital event like a sale or a JV or something along those lines, if you come back to that example of the steel mill, you can't run the steel mill without it, right? You simply can't. So forget about whether or not you can sell it. But that's a ways down the track. You can't even run it without it. If I go to the steel mill and say you can't use your intangible assets, That's the end of the mill. Full stop. And it's the same for a not-for-profit. If I go to somebody, I see from Amnesty International, if I go to Amnesty International and say, you cannot use your donor database, full stop, end of story, and I'll add to that, you can't use your brand, and no software either, and none of your customer supplier relationships, that's the end of Amnesty International. So it's not the capital events that I was demonstrating are just the end result, the most graphic end result of the function of intangible assets. I put those up because if you put up a case study, said we worked with this company and it does great intangible assets, and we've developed this cool strategy. There's no so what. There's no what actually happened at the end. And so what I'm trying to do with the case studies is demonstrate that these actually have an impact. And the easiest way to see an impact is through a capital event. But quite frankly, it's there from day one. If you don't have them, you don't have a business, in short.
Great, thanks. So I think Peter, one for you. What about your thoughts on company culture and value? So how does this all? This is your area. How would this all fit together?
So it's like Paul's been saying, the culture that values and recognizes innovation is going to make a big difference. So if we really want to build an innovative backdrop of assets, then that culture, that set of behaviors has to match that behavior. But we're used to exploitive. We're used to a culture which values low risk, which values doing the same, not anything different, because that's safe and that's worked for years and years. So we have this backdrop of statism, of doing what we like to do, and it's difficult to for many to superimpose upon that something like a risk-taking, adventuristic, maybe even seemingly trite type of activity, which is innovation. So it requires separating the two cultures. Practice says, okay, you're going to have to, sometimes you spin out and form a little startup to manage the innovation part of your organization, or you have two separate organizations reporting separately to the CEO. All of this to try and allow the two cultures to exist and thrive independently, because otherwise this big exploitive one inexorably will diminish the exploratory one.
Thank you. So Paul, this is an interesting one. So how does what are the implications for the New Zealand economy in relation to this, and in particular for small? New Zealand is made up a lot of small and medium enterprises that maybe don't think of themselves as having large intangible assets. How would you answer that?
Well, I think all businesses, regardless of if they're large or small, have intangible assets. The only real exception to that is pure real estate plays. If you buy a bungalow in Grey Lynn and do it up, then no, you're not really leveraging intangible assets. You're actually just floating with the market, right? So to the extent that New Zealand is not basically a housing market with an economy tacked on, which you would argue sometimes it is, intangibles are important to every business, regardless of their size. And generally, however, you would say about the New Zealand economy is that it is an economy which obviously focuses on the production of soft commodities, so milk and horticulture and meat and so forth. And one of the issues is that those tend to be lower intangible asset intensive industries, so they generate fewer numbers of intangible assets. The issues with that is that they tend to generate commodities as a consequence, and commodities by their definition have lower competitive advantage, right? And you end up being a price taker when you're generating a commodity, which is what Peter was talking about at the very start. Whereas on the other hand, that if you have collection and you have companies that generate high value intangible assets or are intangible asset intensive, they tend to be more differentiated and have higher barriers to entry, and therefore have more competitive advantage, and therefore tend to be price makers. So if we look at economies like, for example, Finland, or like peer economies to New Zealand, like Finland, Taiwan, Singapore, Ireland to a certain extent, which have all focused more on the development of intangible asset-based industries, they have outperformed New Zealand. And in fact, if you go back to the mid-1950s, New Zealand was the second wealthiest country in the world in terms of GDP per capita. Today, it's about the 23rd. And Singapore has more or less inverted itself, right, relative to New Zealand, because it focused, for example, on the development of industries that leveraged intangible assets, whereas we kept on pumping out wool and fruit and meat and so forth. And so in general, New Zealand needs to focus more on the development of intangible assets, intensive companies, right from the very top, the Fonterras of the world, all the way through to startups.
Great. So just to add to that, Peter, how do you think with nations, as Paul mentioned, all the nations trying to become more innovative, how can New Zealand compete in this market with all these nations around the world trying to be more competitive? What is our comparative advantage?
So I would say, first of all, we've got to find what we're different at. And that's kind of a very intriguing question because you have to look for it. So the example I gave earlier was that hoki skin. The skin of hoki in our fish in our waters is soluble. That makes it very special. So for some reason or other, we have an edge in making soluble masks. The more recent example is Rocket Lab. So we have a long east coast, and along that east coast, there's no air traffic to mention. So you want to, when you launch rockets, you launch vertically to get them into west to east orbit. And so a long east coast with not much traffic is ideal for regular uninterrupted launching. That one point of difference enabled Rocket Lab to establish its differentiation on a world scale. Now, once you've got that frontier firm here, it's a basis for a whole other industry about communications, satellite development, data surveillance, evaluation, data management. A whole cluster of industries now form around that point of difference. So these points of difference, you might say, well, what's different? Go and find it, because there's lots of differences and they're somewhat unexpected.
Great. And Paul, it seems that what you're talking about has a lot of implications for accounting standards, and that to value these intangible assets, there needs to be changes in accounting standards, or could create challenges for companies. When will the accounting standards be changed, or will they be changed?
Good question. They're not likely to change anytime soon. In short, that's the short answer to the question. And the reason is twofold, really, fundamentally. Number one, it would require virtually every company in the world to restate its earnings, right? And because it would result in a dramatic change in the way that companies essentially evaluated their financial performance in their balance sheets. And that in turn would require have a massive shift in capital, because all of a sudden, all of the results, all of the numbers that you're investing capital against and you're allocating capital against, both internally within large companies and externally by investors into those companies, would need to change as well. So we're talking about an enormous, enormous change. The second reason is that there's a lot of vested interest in keeping it the way it is, right down to simple things like all the accountants have been taught to think about the world in a particular way. So here's a useful analogy. If you look at your keyboards in front of you, you notice you use a QWERTY keyboard, right? The QWERTY keyboard was designed when people still used manual typewriters in order to slow typing down, right? Because people type too quick and the hammers got fouled up. So they developed the QWERTY keyboard to slow you down, right? So you could not type quickly. Obviously, we don't use keyboards with hammers anymore, but everybody's stuck using a QWERTY keyboard. It's not the most efficient way to type. But can you imagine if you ripped out everybody's QWERTY keyboard and gave them a new, better organized one? What the chaos that would eventuate? That's the same thing with intangible assets. So there's not going to be a change anytime soon. So the best thing to do is to recognize that this problem exists and deal with it in the sense of be among the small group of people who understand it and take advantage of the information asymmetry, rather than continuing to be on the side essentially of those that refuse to recognize it and therefore don't understand what real value is created.
Great, thanks. Well, I'm still typing with 2 fingers, so I'd be okay with the change of keyboard.
Yeah,
but
you're just gonna wait for the fully voice control.
That's right. I mean,
yeah.
There you go. I was wondering why I never learned, but now I know. I'm waiting for the change.
Yeah.
Okay. And Peter, how, in New Zealand we tend to be very open, right, and sharing ideas. how do we protect our ideas when we're innovating, right?
Yeah,
So we're letting people know about other ideas, and we talk about being collaborative, but they can be stolen.
Sure. Well, firstly, most people aren't out to steal your ideas, but some are. So if you want to have one of these open collaborative discussions, be very careful. But having said that, I would suggest that you can talk about benefits and opportunity. You don't necessarily have to talk about your underlying technology and capabilities. So for example, back to NanoLayer, they have a face mask which is made of collagen and it can dissolve and get into the skin. We don't talk about how it's made. We don't talk about the formulation. That's the how. But you can talk a long time about the what in order for the trust to build up, the CDAs to be signed, the patents to be protected. So don't get all muffled up and afraid to move. Just remember, you talk about the benefits, but not necessarily the attributes or the underlying capabilities.
Great, thanks. And this can be for both, but I'll start with Paul. You know, you're working with a lot of traditional industries, I imagine. You talked about the steel industry, and how do you convince them of the operating? You know, they're operating in an old, homogeneous model, and maybe they don't believe in the assets, or maybe you're a middle level manager, and you want to convince your CEO. How do you usually go about that when you're working with companies?
To be honest, it's not much different than what I just put in front of you. The data doesn't lie. Like it's absolutely unequivocal, and it's backed up by, that data is backed up by mountains of research, and you can run those thought experiments. If you really want to, and you're wanting to convince your boss, go into them and say, look, intangible is the most important thing in the company. And he'll say, or she will say, whatever, prove it. So, okay, cool. For the next hour, you're not allowed to use, let's say make it challenging, a day. Not allowed to use our brand, our software, our data, customer supplier relationships, confidential information, regulatory approvals, nothing that is intangible. You can use only physical things, and watch that business grind to a halt. That's probably the single best thing that you can do, because what it forces people to do is come to the realization that the world moved on 45 years ago. It's fundamentally different than what it was. And the problem is, as humans, we didn't evolve that quickly. And so our ways of thinking about and perceiving the universe is still very much rooted in a physical object mentality. And so you kind of need to get beyond that. And so that's why if you might have noticed in the presentation, I talked about data, but I also gave you thought examples to work with. So.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I'm just looking at our time, and I think our time is up here. So I just first of all like to thank you both for contributing to this discussion. It was really, really great. And I learned a lot. I've seen Paul speak before, and Peter, so I really always learn something. So thank you very much. I hope the audience, you've enjoyed the discussion. We'll be having a series of these discussions, so we'll follow up with you to let you know when these are taking place. And this discussion really represents what is taking place in our executive and professional development group, right? So we can work with companies, with individuals to do executive training and development. And Peter and Paul have both been speakers on our program. So this is the kind of interaction you're going to have. Just in closing, we mentioned we're going to have a raffle. So we'll be raffling off a free short course, and we'll be sending out information on that. And myself and Noah will follow up. My colleague Noah will forward you an email with information on contacting us. With that, I think I'd just like to say thank you for everybody who participated, and have a great rest of your afternoon. I'm looking forward to checking and see if I can travel over Christmas. Okay, take care.
Cheers. Thanks,
guys. Bye-bye.